In this video, I want to see if I can get GPT to correctly solve a variant of the classic river crossing puzzle. In particular, I want to see if we can devise a zero-shot prompt to do this successfully. That is, a prompt which only poses the question without adding a lot of additional context or examples. So to start with, let's just quickly review what this particular river crossing puzzle is. So this is a well-known logic puzzle which has a few different variations, the most common of which is this wolf, goat, and cabbage variation. And according to Wikipedia, this particular puzzle dates back to at least the 9th century. So this is pretty interesting because that means there's going to be quite a lot of content online and in other sources which depict this particular problem, which means that ChatGPT has definitely been trained on many examples of this particular problem. So in this logical problem, you have usually a farmer and then 3 items on one side of a river, and the farmer has a boat and he needs to transport all 3 items across the river safely. And he can only transport 1 item at a time with him in the boat, and there's a few particular constraints that he has to follow. So for example, in this common variation with the fox, goat, and the cabbage, he cannot leave the wolf, the goat, and the cabbage. He cannot leave the wolf and the goat together at the same time on one side of the river, and he also cannot leave the goat and the cabbage together at one time on one side of the river. So you have to figure out a particular sequence to move back and forth between both sides of the river to move all of these items over. So you can look through the solution here, and the important thing is that the first step usually includes taking the goat over. So you can imagine that GPT has been trained on many examples of something looking like this, which always includes taking the goat over first. Now, as you might expect, if you pose the puzzle to GPT exactly as it's phrased here, it will easily be able to arrive at the correct solution, probably because it's been trained on so much data that has examples of solutions like the one here. However, if you tweak the problem statement slightly, as this person did in their post on Hacker News a few weeks ago, then GPT really struggles to arrive at the correct answer. So for instance, this person says, suppose they have a cabbage, a goat, and a lion, and they need to get them across the river. They have a boat and they can only carry 1 item at a time. But here they say they cannot leave the cabbage and the lion alone together. So this is the key difference, which is actually not the same as the original structure of the problem. So they also cannot leave the lion and the goat together, but normally in this problem, you cannot leave the goat and the cabbage together. But here they're saying they cannot leave the lion alone with either item, but it's implied that you can actually leave the goat and the cabbage together. So then they ask how can they safely get all of these across the river. Now, if you stop and think about it, the only way to do this is to first transport the lion across, because it's not possible to transport the cabbage or the goat across first because you would violate either of these conditions. So if you move the lion across first, you can then think through a few additional steps to transport them all across, and it's not too hard to do that. I think most humans would be able to reason through this fairly easily given this initial constraint. The interesting thing is that when you pose this particular variation of the problem to GPT, it's unable to arrive at the correct solution on the first try. And as this person points out, even after they repeatedly told GPT about their mistake, it was unable to still arrive at the correct solution and continued to repeat that it should take the goat first, which is interesting because over here, it also says to take the goat first. So it appears that GPT really struggles with this particular variation on a common problem, and also is unable to arrive at the correct ability to reason through this particular puzzle. Now, I recently watched this video from the AI Explained YouTube channel, which introduces this so-called smart GPT system. And this proposed smart GPT system effectively uses a few steps of input and output from GPT to arrive at an overall more robust answer to a particular prompt. And the way this works is that it starts with some user input, and then it passes it through this particular prompt, which is coming from this research paper here, which evaluated a few different variations of prompt structures. And in this prompt, it uses a question plus an answer prefixed by the statement, let's work this out in a step-by-step way to be sure we have the right answer. So first, this prompt is used to generate 3 different variations of output, and then those 3 outputs are all combined and fed back in with an additional prompt which encourages GPT to evaluate these different options and then choose the best one, critiquing it and improving upon it if necessary. So this was able to arrive at overall better responses for a variety of different tasks and questions. So I wanted to see if we could use any variation on those prompts listed in this research paper, and then also on this, this structure of serial prompting to be able to solve this particular variation of the river crossing puzzle with GPT. To start with, I just asked GPT the question directly, and as you might expect, GPT replies that we should first take the goat across. This, of course, is not the correct answer, and this is similar to the results that the original poster got in their post here. So then I told GPT multiple times that their first step was not allowed, and do they think that there are any other options, and they're still stuck on the idea of taking the goat first. So we have here, take the goat first, and then once again, take the goat first across the river, and then yet again, take the goat first across the river. So here I say, you're still making the same mistake. Why do you think you can leave the lion and the cabbage together? And it still wants to take the goat first. So eventually I have to tell it very clearly, you cannot take the goat first. What other options do you have for step one? And then it tries to take the cabbage first, which is also not allowed. So finally, I tell it again that you cannot take the cabbage first. And so then eventually it arrives at the correct answer, which is that you must take the lion across the river first. So this is really not ideal, and it really shows pretty clearly how GPT is not able to answer this question if the question is stated verbatim, just like this. So the question I had then was, is there any way I can modify the prompt? And so before getting into the different prompt variations in the paper, I wanted to first see if GPT itself might be able to give me any better options for how to modify the prompt. So I followed on and asked it several more questions. And I asked it if it could provide any other variations on the prompt that might help it to arrive at the answer in a more clear way. So it did give me some interesting variations on the prompt. For instance, it suggested changing the items in the puzzle, and then it also suggested making it more clear about the puzzle constraints, and it made a few other suggestions. But I tried these out in other tabs with a fresh conversation history, and I also tried a bunch of other variations that I could think of, and none of them were able to essentially break GPT out of this reliance on using the common solution, which is to always start with taking the goat first. So I thought this was an interesting experiment, and it was interesting talking to GPT here and seeing what other suggestions it had, but unfortunately this was not fruitful, and none of these approaches resulted in the correct approach to solving the question. So next, I wanted to go through and use the different prompts that were discussed in this paper here. So this paper was published pretty recently, and they evaluated a bunch of different prompting techniques to see which one would have the best performance. And these different prompts are listed out in the appendix down here. So you can see that their name for the prompt here in this column, and then the text that they used in the prompt over here on the right side. So these were first a few prompts used in other research papers, in particular this one, which produced the best performance, the step-by-step way to make sure we have the right answer. And then these others down here also produced interesting results, and these were all custom prompts that were developed in this particular paper. So I wanted to go through and use most of these and see if they produced any better results. So first, interestingly, this prompt, the step-by-step thinking prompt, actually did not produce any better results here. And I've also changed the items in the puzzle slightly. Here we have a banana, a squirrel, and a fox. And here it chooses to take the squirrel across the river first, which is effectively the same as taking the goat in the original variation of the problem. So here it's choosing to do the same thing again. And then if we move on to the next custom prompt they used in the paper here, which is answer the question and then critique the answer, it also takes the squirrel first. So this still is not producing any better results. And then finally, in this prompt, I was able to produce an interesting result. So this prompt says, first, let's rephrase the question to be sure we understood it correctly. Second, let's work this out step by step by spelling out our thoughts and reasoning so anyone can verify them. Third, make sure we have the right answer. So in this case, the first time I asked GPT with this prompt, it actually was able to outline that there's two options for the first step. One, taking the squirrel first, which of course, is not correct. And then option 2 is taking the fox first. So this is the correct first step. And then it concludes by saying, therefore, for the first trip across the river, you can choose to take either the squirrel or the fox with you. So this is pretty interesting because it actually gets close to identifying the right answer. It gets this like basically half right. And if you read through the additional steps here, it is able to figure out, or it is able to reason through correctly, the additional steps to get all 3 of the items across the river. So this is quite interesting. And this was the only, you could say, zero-shot prompt that I was able to use to produce a partially correct answer. However, I did regenerate this response 2 times, and in both of the regenerated responses, we get the wrong answer. So here, it concludes to take the squirrel first, and then if I regenerated it one more time, we also see that it wants to take the squirrel first. So perhaps that first response was just a bit lucky, but at any rate, I did have a lot of conversations with GPT here, as you can see, and this was the only zero-shot prompt which was able to get close to a correct answer. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, if we go through the remaining couple prompts here in the paper, here's one where it has to create a dialogue between a professor and a student, and in this dialogue, it kind of jumbles up the logic here and eventually concludes that it should take the banana first. So this also is not correct, and then it goes on with a bunch of other steps here. And then in this next prompt, which also has more details about how it should outline its reasoning, it also concludes that it has some faulty reasoning for why it cannot take the fox first, and then it concludes that in the first step it should take the squirrel with the person. So then finally, I wanted to use some structures similar to what was outlined in this Smart GPT paper, where I basically passed in some previous output from GPT, where, for instance, it was suggesting that it should take the squirrel first, and then I had GPT critique the response, and then potentially modify it if necessary. So I tried a few variations of this, and here's one example of that. And in this case, almost all of the initial responses I got would be choosing to take the squirrel first. So they didn't have enough variation for me to really feel like it made sense to have multiple options or multiple previous responses here. So I just had one original answer, and then I had GPT try to critique this. But in both cases that I'm going to show here, GPT basically evaluates this and says the original reasoning is correct and doesn't need to be changed at all. So this is one example of that. And then here is another example. The provided response is correct, no major critiques are provided, and you should still take the banana across the river first, or the squirrel across the river first. So it still is unable to really get its reasoning correct. Maybe there's some other variation using this Smart GPT system that would help it to arrive at the correct answer, but in my testing here, I wasn't able to find anything like that. So finally, this is the only prompt structure that I was able to use to actually produce the correct result from GPT. So this is essentially the few shot or the 1 or 2 shot prompt structure, where you provide an example of the problem, which follows a very similar structure, and that's kind of used as a guide for GPT to figure out how to answer the particular question. So this does feel quite contrived to me, especially in this example, where the kind of example that you're giving for your particular puzzle is so similar to the actual puzzle itself. So you can see here I'm saying that we're on one side of a river and we have an apple, a rabbit, and a wolf, and then I'm saying you have to take the wolf first. And then the actual puzzle scenario, we have a banana, the squirrel, and the fox, and then I'm telling it to first outline its reasoning, and then second, provide an answer. So it does actually arrive at the correct answer, which is taking the fox first. And interestingly, this is actually the GPT 3.5 model. Of course, if I tried this with GPT-4, it also was able to answer correctly. And both were able to do that with either 1 or 2 example scenarios. So this is a bit interesting because this does reliably produce the correct answer, but it does require this first example here, which is quite contrived, and it feels very hard-coded to the particular puzzle scenario that we're asking. These results are interesting and also, I think, fairly consistent with this other research paper here, which describes how GPT's performance was boosted in terms of theory of mind via particular prompting techniques. So in particular, if we scroll down here, we can see that Some of the particular prompts they used are these two-shot plus chain of reasoning prompts where they do something very similar to what I did here with the river crossing puzzle, where they provide previous scenarios and examples of how to solve them. And they're also using the thinking step-by-step approach. And then finally, they pose the final question to GPT, and it has to complete the sentence. So this produced very good results, and this is very similar to the approach that I was using here. Authors' papers also conclude that in their research, the improved performance of the LLMs via prompting does not appear to be due to simple mimicry of the specific reasoning steps provided in the chain of thought examples. They conclude that it seems that the LLMs are able to more generally apply reasoning methods to solve the particular problems that they're faced with. So I think the paper's conclusions here are pretty interesting, and they say their results are not consistent with the claim that these models lack theory of mind reasoning capability. And in particular, their results are practically significant because they show how to aid LLMs in some forms of social reasoning. More abstractly, the results are another reminder that LLM behavior is highly complex and context sensitive. However, in these particular examples with the river crossing puzzle, I did definitely get a sense that the model has a very hard time of generalizing particular reasoning thought processes outside of the context of information that it's seen before. I think because this is a puzzle that has been trained on probably many times, it was very difficult for it to break out of that particular pattern and reason about it in a more general sense. So it is a bit interesting to consider to what extent it's actually reasoning from first principles here when it's able to answer the question correctly versus just pattern matching based on the additional context that you provide in the prompt. So this is definitely an interesting question that will continue to be quite interesting in potentially future variations of ChatGPT. All right, to conclude, this was an interesting exploration of improving GPT's performance on particular prompts, but unfortunately it wasn't really able to solve this particular river crossing puzzle with a zero-shot prompt. If you have any creative prompting ideas and can manage to solve this particular variation of the river crossing puzzle using a zero-shot prompt, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Please give the channel a subscribe if you found this interesting, and I'll see you next time.